glad you've all made your way here to Amsterdam, and we want to welcome you to a first with ISE, our very first keynote session, and we've tried to find somebody who would be inspirational, but also looking at someone that really knows something about where our business is going or where our business could be going. I'd like to welcome Gerhard Schultz, is the Senior VP of Ingram for EMEA, and he will be presenting how to a blueprint for business growth in the digital age. We've seen this and we've been quite inspired by what he heard, but let me bring Gerhard on stage and he can tell you about what you can expect. Please.
Yeah, good evening. I'm very proud to be able to speak in front of such an audience which we as an IT distributor typically don't meet. Let me give you just quick words of my role. I'm running a fairly large operation of an IT distributor, in Germany, in Austria, Switzerland, as well as in Hungary. And what I want to present to you today, is the evolution of the IT industry, of digital industry over the past, couple of years, and how digitalization will make inroads basically into the analog world, representatives of which you are actually here. So I think it's not a secret that the analog world gets more and more replaced by digital products and by digitalization. Now let me talk first a little bit about what is enabling, or what are enabling trends of why and where basically digital products are replacing the analog world. There are a couple of drivers which have made this conversion basically come true. About 30 years ago, Gordon Moore, happens to head up Intel Semiconductor together with Andy Grove. He said that the number of transistors on a single processor will multiply basically every single 2 years. And that law, which is called Gordon Moore's law right now, holds true since more than 30 years right now. Now actually, on the second dimension of IT development, there is data capacity. And actually, the Gordon Moore's law also hold true, in data capacity. Since more than 2 decades, data capacity is more than doubling every single 2 years. 20 years ago, you had about 20 megabytes of hard disk drives on an 8-inch size. Today, you have around 3 terabytes of data capacity, which is fitting on a 2.5-inch drive. Which means, 2 high-resolution pictures in the past were, utilizing this drive, and today you have the equivalent of 600,000 high-definition pictures or 300 hours of video streams, on such a single device. Now, the third dimension of IT development, which is actually, the networking bandwidth, actually, Gordon Moore's law did hold true also in networking bandwidth. When 20 years ago, you had Ethernet capacity at around 10 megabytes per second. Today, Ethernet, technology is able to transmit more than 100 gigabits per second over the same, or over single wires. So actually, those 3 dimensions of, IT development have driven, the digitalization of our world. Furthermore, standards have enabled digital products, to penetrate, our world as well. And the most prominent example here is the IP protocol, which is the basis for the internet. It actually has allowed data, video, as well as voice data to be transmitted at the same point of time over a single network, and has enabled basically the digital world to prosper. Furthermore, the energy consumption has been driven down much to a very large extent, and so it has enabled mobile digital applications to operate for a fairly long period of time. Smartphone devices would not be, existing in our world if energy consumption wouldn't have been driven down to the extent where it is right now. So the last enabler of, the digitalization of our world is actually cost. As soon as products have been converged from the analog world to the digital world, cost, has been driven down to a very large extent. Today, you can produce chip devices, for example, for RFID applications in cent levels, which is basically the last key enabler of the digital world, replacing analog products. Now, if we're talking about the digitalization of this world, you cannot prevent to talk about how computers have evolved. Now, about 40 years ago, we started with mainframes. 30 years ago, LANs and workstations came along, followed thereafter by PCs who happen to communicate via the internet on a mobile or a fixed wire fashion. So about 10 years ago, the PC industry or the computing industry or the IT industry has left computers and has ended up in an ambiguous network of devices, each one of them being able to be hooked up to the network in a wired or non-wired, basically, fashion. So today, we have a network of things, comprised of computers as well as other digital devices which make up the overall digital world. Now, to give you a sense of what kind of areas of magnitudes we're talking about, today there's about 2 billion users connected to the internet. About half of them, there's about 1.3 billion smart devices, so-called smart devices, which you can use to access the internet. And there's about 1.2 billion PCs or computers being hooked up the internet. Now, how is that developing over the next couple of years? You will see 25 billion digital devices being hooked up to the internet in one shape or form. That's about 3 times the number of population in our world. So, question is, how can that be? The development which is taking place right now in the digital world, it means that not only human users will use the internet, there will be more and more machine-to-machine communication over the internet. Embedded applications without users, will use the internet. So literally every single device on the planet of electronic nature will be networked and hooked up to the internet. So when we're talking, about growth in the digital world, there are many areas, where you see exponential growth in the digital world. Now, what I've tried to do here is to cluster those growth segments into 3 what we call meta trends. The first of them being ubiquity, which means that our environment gets increasingly penetrated with digital products hooked up, onto any kind of networking. Let me give you a couple of examples of where that happens. Physical security is one area. In the past, you had analog cameras, which meanwhile are of digital nature, and they're hooked up via the IP protocol to the internet, enabling, digital surveillance applications which have not been existing in the past. A second area, and the large portion of the audience here, represents an industry called digital signage. That industry has moved from a truly analog world to a digital world right now, where looking forward, you will have touch-based devices hooked up to the network, being controlled via gestures and not only, into one direction. So you will have interactive digital devices which you can use for your purposes, such as, advertising. Next area of an application is healthcare. In the past, you had a lot of analog products because of the high frequency requirements in the healthcare environment. Meanwhile, digitalization has reached a level of resolution, a level of security, and a level of performance where literally every analog devices in the healthcare environment are replaced by digitalization. Measuring your pulse is meanwhile done in a digital world, in a digital fashion, and the data of the human bodies are transmitted by either Wi-Fi or by Bluetooth or any other networking means, transmitted straight to the doctor for further analysis. And so those three areas are just three examples of multiple other growth areas which have been enabled and will be enabled growth areas through the digitalization of our worlds. Our cars, as an example, have meanwhile up to 50 microprocessors included, all of them obviously operating based on digital technology. And you can read it yourself how many different areas of our life and our environments are penetrated as a result of the digitalization of our world. So ubiquity means that literally every single area of our life gets penetrated by the digitalization. A second mega trend or meta trend we call is convergence. There are different areas where our products are more and more converging, markets are converging, and resulting channels are converging. So let me give you just three key examples of this. Number one, convergence is taking place in our home. Each one of us used to have a lot of analog devices in our home being replaced by digital devices. So, record players in the past have been replaced with CD players, analog video recorders have been replaced by digital recorders, and so on and so forth. But what actually is happening right now is that all of those devices, which have been standalone and discrete devices, number one, get networked, and number two, will get converged into two key devices, one of them being called smart TVs. The ones of you who have visited the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas the other week have seen that a key development in the consumer electronic industry is that TVs get smart, they get networked, they will become touch, and they will even have a human interface going forward, which is controlled via so-called apps. So you will have multiple devices in the home being converged towards the TV set, which ultimately may even emerge, to the source or the center of control in your home. The second device, which will be, converged is actually the PC. So you will see set-top boxes, consoles, and what have you, converging onto two devices, one of them being the smart TV on one hand, and the other one being the PC on the other hand. So conversion actually happens in your home. There's a second area, key area of convergence, where convergence is happening, and that's in your hand. When you have watches, cameras, mobile devices and phones in the past, all of those devices will get converged onto a smartphone device or a smart device of various form factors, such as 2.5-inch for smartphones, up to 10-inch devices for the very prominent tablets these days. So functionality of those devices will to a lesser degree be dependent on the actual hardware. It will depend on the applications and on the software which run on those devices. And last but not least, there is a third area where convergence is actually happening, and that's in the infrastructure. You see in the past, or you've seen various infrastructure providers such as telephone networks, cable networks, or satellite networks, each one of them being dedicated to a certain kind of information being transmitted. A telephone network was predominantly focusing on voice. A satellite network was predominantly focusing on video streams of analog or digital nature. Meanwhile, you see each one of those infrastructure providers and service providers transmitting and selling data, video, and voice services in a converged fashion. And going forward, you will see power companies, the more smart, the power distribution will get to also sell those services, to the end consumer, may it be businesses or consumers. So the third area where convergence really takes place is on the infrastructure basis and related services. So convergence actually, is the second meta trend which determines and will determine the strategies of companies of our shape and form. So at the end of the day, you see devices, services, and infrastructure converging onto, the digital world and digital network. So after ubiquity, convergence, there is a third area where you can cluster growth segments in the digital world around, and that is called XaaS. X stands for everything is sold as a service. Now what has begun with Apple coming out with the iPhone a couple of years ago, is setting itself forth right now as an exponential fashion. So let me explain you what I mean. With a smart device such as an iPhone or similar devices, you have the processing power of about 1/10 of a PC. So if you look at what the capabilities of those devices are, more than 90% of the applications which you run on a PC today can be actually run on those smart devices, may it be a tablet or a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch smartphone. Now you may ask yourself, how is that possible? The reason for why that's possible is that the physical processing is not taking place in your hand. It's taking place in a remote data center where the processing actually is conducted. And that is enabled through the availability of very high network bandwidth. You can trigger a processing in your hand and have the physical processing being conducted somewhere else, which means that you are purchasing as a consumer processing power and bandwidth on an as-needed basis using the very popular applets. So what has started in the consumer world set itself forth, meanwhile, also in the business world, which means storage capacity, CPU capacity, as well as networking capacity will be purchased over the network and driven by the huge bandwidth which we have available meanwhile. It is not a problem to have processing and data being remote from the physical location. So you see business models evolving where those different dimensions of IT, processing, bandwidth and storage, as well as software or complete infrastructures, will be purchased on an as-needed basis, thus driving flexibility of corporations and companies to a much higher extent than what was possible today. And even your industry right now is moving more and more towards service-based business models. So that's the third mega trend which we see actually happening, which we call sell everything as a service. Now, if you do those kind of presentations and talk about how things are evolving, you also have to look at how the value chain physically, the digital value chain has evolved. Let me give you an example on how the value chain was looking in the past. You had content providers, basically, where video or audio content was being resold separately. There were companies creating the content. There were companies physically reselling the content, which were retailers. And there were companies which manufactured products to physically play the content, such as a company called Sony or whatsoever. Now that value chain has changed in the past years dramatically. Meanwhile, you see service providers reselling content because content is being transmittable over the network. You know, digital rights have evolved to an extent which allows you to sell services, sell content through the network. And physical devices are continue to be resold through retail or through e-tailers, while physical data content and digital content is being resold through the network. Also, what happened was on the hardware side, you saw an increasing fragmentation, of the value chain. You have third-party manufacturers, meanwhile, which manufacture the bulk of the IT hardware as of today. You see about industries which are more than $200 billion large, which manufacture PCs, and computers on behalf of the large OEMs such as Apple, Lenovo, Acer, and what have you. Now, what happens in the past years is, and that's very important for your businesses to be designed, is that there are players emerging which vertically integrate literally across the whole value chain. The most prominent example being Apple, who started as a hardware manufacturer and meanwhile ended up as somebody who even provides content very successfully with the iTunes platform. There are also companies which go the other way around, which is backward integration. Prominent example being Google, which started as a content provider and a service provider in the internet, and through the purchase of Motorola, meanwhile, is operating in the hardware business. Last but not least, you see content not only being provided by professional content providers, also we as consumers are more and more creating content, most prominent example here in YouTube. Now, the question is, what does all that mean, the evolution of the digital world on one hand, the growth segments on the other hand, and the constant remove and remodeling of the value chain for a company who operates in the digital world. And what I'm going to show you right now is sort of the blueprint of what Ingram Micro as a IT distributor has been using and will be using to take advantage of all those trends. Now, what our business has started with is that we started reselling commodity devices, starting from PCs and the components of which a PC is being made up of, networking devices, software which runs on PCs and systems, digital imaging products to capture images and print images, including the supplies necessary to do that, and last but not least, peripheral consumer electronic devices which are needed basically to input data and display data, in a digital form. So that's what we call, and that's where we started our business, our volume divisions. That volume division had to be complemented by product portfolio and vendor portfolio which make up data centers. Starting from the CPUs, the servers, storage devices, networking products, high-end networking products. Make sure you verticalize your infrastructure, to maximize capacity utilization, make it secure, and last but not least, offer this infrastructure as an aggregator, into the cloud to our resellers. So those are the two pillars which have been built in the past, to run our business as an IT distributor. Now, as digital products replace, analog applications more and more, we've started to create solution areas which require infrastructure products as well as, commodity products on that. The one example being unified communication. You see companies coming from the digital world such as Cisco or Microsoft competing with companies coming from the analog environment such as, Avaya or Polycom, where, those companies are competing with each other, which what we call an area which we call unified communication. You see with unified communication, the telephone world and the voice world converging with the data world. What does that mean? You will see, for example, Outlook, as a office application running on your telephone systems where contact data get shared between the telephone system and your computer, you will see the computer, while telephoning with yourself, via voice over IP, ultimately ending up also with moving data, which is an application of which is video conferencing. So we've created, a division which resulted from the convergence or from the replacement of the analog world to the digital world, which is meanwhile called unified communication. A second area which we've added as a business unit to those two pillars is everything which circles around mobility. You see 2.5-inch devices to 10-inch devices like the tablets, through mobile computers such as notebooks, all of them having to be added to enterprise networks and the related infrastructure. And that's the reason why, or that's the driver why we've created a mobility division. A third division we've created is what we call data capture point of sale. We've acquired 5 companies which were specializing in this area, and you have meanwhile devices where via GPS you can locate where the physical device is, you can scan data with the device and transmit the resulting data over the network. That allows you to conduct applications which so far in the analog world have physically not been possible. Those applications are used in retail, they're used in restaurants, they're used with logistic companies, and even Scotland Yard, an application which we've done, which we've sold a couple of weeks ago, scans the license plates of people who do wrong parking and send you the ticket through their ERP system straight back home, an application of data capture and point of sales devices. Next area where we've created a division taking advantage of the replacement of the analog world through digital products, that is called digital signage. The big portion of your audience is a reflection of this industry. Now, more than 60% of digital signage applications, meanwhile, are networked, which means digital products are emerging into this industry. What we've done here is that, we've started as box movers, as when physical projectors where you had foils on it were replaced by beamers, we started to sell beamers, followed by panels. Meanwhile, whiteboards, which are used in the education space, and realized that in order to effectively sell those products, you require content in order to move into certain vertical markets, one of which being, the example is education. So we've started to add content manufacturers and complement, this content with the physical device in order to access certain vertical markets. We've also realized that in order to successfully sell those devices, we need our networking divisions and add networking products in order to remotely control, the content through the panels. Followed by mounting devices which allow you to hook up the various panels on walls or whatever means of physical connections. Last but not least, we realized that offering services, installation services for those solutions as a distributor is a high demand requirement of specialized retailers or resellers, AV resellers, which were focusing more and more on conceptualizing ideas and actually selling solutions rather than doing the hardware close services. You see, this is an example how we've taken advantage of the move from the analog products to digital products and how we moved away from a pure pick, pack, and ship distributor to a value-added distributor selling complete solutions into various shape or markets. Last but not least, and I'm doing pretty quick on this, the last area we've added is around physical security. I mentioned that already. Also, physical security moved from analog to digital, and it requires from capturing the images to storing the images, meanwhile, so-called network-attached storage devices, which you hook up to the cameras, and you can live even without computers and install complete solutions. Now, what we've realized when adding, those individual components and building blocks, which are based on the two pillars, infrastructure as well as commodity devices, that more and more those product-oriented solutions have to be sold into certain vertical markets. And the way we became pretty selective with vertical markets was driven based on exponential growth areas, which are in certain vertical markets where you see higher growth than in others. Let me give you 3 examples of that. The area of energy, is a very prominent one. What you see increasingly happening is through the increased sensitivity of our population on energy consumption and the resulting demand in renewable energies, there is a big need to bring energy production, which happens in a decentralized fashion as opposed to centralized energy production, and consumption to the smallest possible grid, which is what we call smart grid. Now, in order to control production and consumption, you need computers and IT technology to do that in a smart way. And actually, if you talk about home automation, which is a pretty en vogue term right now, you will see increased household penetration happening not through, life and entertainment type of products. You will see digitalization in our home and home automation predominantly driven and enabled through smart grid type of applications, where you try to synchronize basically your own power production with your own consumption using intelligent meters, using intelligent data loggers and IT type of devices. So that's an area where we already foresee, exponential growth rates, for digital products going forward. The second area is education. Now, physical, digital signage type of products are actually finding themselves a lot in education type of environments. The whiteboard products being very prominent examples of that. So what we are doing is we have created a division which just focuses, on education markets going through resellers who actually focus on schools, universities, and so on and so forth, retrieving products from our portfolio which are standard, complemented with products which are dedicated to the education market. A company like Apple just has announced that it will support, digitalization of education content and actually move into this market big time. An $8 billion market just in the United States is the education market for analog education products. Last but not least, we've added an area called healthcare. You see more and more products being digitalized in hospitals, as I already mentioned. X-ray type of products, which so far have been analog because of the high frequency requirements and the reliability. There are meanwhile manufacturers such as NEC, who are manufacturing panels which you can use, in medical environments for X-ray display. So that is the third area where we've moved into a digital market. So into a vertical market here. So what Ingram Micro has been doing, and that's what I try to illustrate here, is to move away from a commodity box moving player by adding, data center products and selling them even as a service, and then more and more, moving into solution type of businesses complemented by certain vertical markets. So we do that today with hundreds of manufacturers and traditionally selling through IT resellers, through thousands of IT resellers. Now, by building up this blueprint for digital growth, which I was just alluding to, we've been adding thousands and thousands of resellers which come from the analog world, such as AV resellers for digital signage, such as electricians for energy consumption products, or physical security, which they are used to install, or even unified communication type of products. And PBX resellers, companies which so far have installed analog telephone systems, which are more and more getting digitalized, and those helping those companies to move into a digital world, for example, in this unified communication. So by this means, we not only have helped our IT resellers to emerge and enter those two markets, we also have helped analog resellers of whatever shape and form, the most conservative ones probably being electricians, to evolve into this new world of digitalization, replacing analog products. Now, if you look what kind of competencies are required in order to get this evolution conducted. So far, we've been playing with IT vendors, distributing the products through IT resellers. Today and tomorrow, we're even adding content providers, to our vendor network, and addressing analog resellers, and also more and more ISVs. As more and more value creation is sitting in the software and in the physical content, traditionally we've received our sales leads from our resellers directly. More and more we receive sales leads from people who do the physical programming, who create the software solutions, and they refer us to projects which are implemented by systems integrators going on. Now, what you see happening is that by this quickly evolving value chain, it is literally impossible that you can keep and generate and maintain digital competencies in your own shop and being up to date all the time. So more and more, and we see that trend happening, in particular in the United States, where we've built a network of competences of resellers. You need to network with players, which complement your knowledge in order to drive solutions. And what we also see happening is, you look at the value chain, more and more the individual components of the value chain in the digital world are getting commodity. So the individual components of solutions are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, while at the same point of time, the solutions add in complexity. So what you see happening, where the margin is actually generated, it is not in the hardware anymore. As soon as products get digital, it is more and more in the systems integration, systems integration capacity and skill set. So the margin potential in the value chain is shifting away from the individual components of solutions more and more, towards systems integration capabilities, where you need to network, with different shapes of competencies in order to be up to date with the ever-changing, competence profile required. So as a summary of that, let me just talk a little bit about my company first before I go into the summary here. So, this is what Ingram Micro, has actually built, and meanwhile, this company, is of a size of $40 billion US, being one of the Fortune 100 companies on this planet. And we're distributing our revenue streams pretty equally across 4 continents, with about half of the business being conducted in the United States, 30% of the business in Europe, 20% business in Asia Pacific, and about 5% of the business in Latin America. So what this company has actually evolved is, as I said, from a pure box mover to a solution provider, and following, the digitalization of this world, which meanwhile have left computers. So the question is, where is that all going? And number one, what I tried to get across as a message today was, you can be assured that, driven by Gordon Moore's law, literally every analog application over time will get replaced by digital applications. Number two, ubiquity of products, where products get instant on, or at least in very low latency connected to the network, combined with the data bandwidths available, you will see, data and processing happening remote from the locations. Which means ultimately, our whole industry will move towards an as-service, or towards a service model, which has substantial, consequences for us all, having so far, provided physical products and software around. Number three, every device will be networked. It will be identified, either things or people will be identified by RFID, and it will be trackable, by GPS type of networks. So you will see literally every single device being networked. And number four, to maintain competencies of this digital world in order to sell, effectively solutions, you can't do that alone anymore. You need to be part of a network of resellers and distributors and vendors, in order to resell to enterprises or to consumers, more or less complex and network solutions. So this is basically what I tried to get across today to you, to this audience, is that the world shifting rather quickly. You've seen with the example of Apple or the other example of Google, how quickly, people can replace others people's offerings. So, to close this presentation today, before we move into questions, build your networks, don't build your competencies alone, and collaborate basically between the analog world and the digital world, being prepared that more and more, your analog world gets replaced by digital, gets commoditized, and so on and so forth. So with this,